The right hand traveled exactly 14 inches through the humid main air, cutting through space and time and skepticism with precision of a surgeon's scalpel. In the fraction of a second it took to cross the distance between Muhammad Ali's shoulder and Sonny Liston's jaw, boxing history splintered into 1,000 different versions of truth, each one defended with the passion of religious conviction. The central main youth center gymnasium pulsed with anticipation that had been building since dawn. When the first spectators began arriving in pickup trucks and station wagons, their breath visible in the cold morning air as they waited for the doors to open. By fight time, 3,000 bodies had transformed the modest venue into a pressure cooker of expectation, their collective body heat raising the temperature to levels that made sweat bead on the overhead lights and created a shimmer in the air above the ring. Ali's feet had been dancing across the canvas for exactly 2 minutes and 12 seconds when his body coiled with the instinctive precision that separated champions from pretenders. Every step had been calculated, every movement designed to create the exact positioning necessary for what was about to unfold. His breathing remained controlled despite the pace he had been setting, his chest rising and falling with a measured rhythm of a man who had trained his body to function as a perfectly calibrated weapon. The crowd noise formed layers of sound that pressed against the ring from all directions. Conversations in the upper rows mixing with shouts from ringside. Beer vendors calling their wares blending with the constant hum of 3,000 people breathing, shifting, anticipating the violence they had paid to witness. Cigarette smoke created a haze that caught the harsh arena lighting, giving the entire scene the ethereal quality of a fever dream. Liston moved forward with mechanical aggression that had terrorized heavyweight divisions for years, his massive frame cutting through the ring space like a battleship through calm waters. Each step carried the weight of a man who had learned violence in the streets of St. Louis, who had refined it in the boxing gyms of Chicago, who had perfected it in championship fights that left opponents unconscious and crowds satisfied with the brutal efficiency of his craft. The former champion's left shoulder dipped slightly, a tell that had escaped the notice of previous opponents, but registered in Ali's peripheral vision like a flashing warning light. The movement was subtle, almost imperceptible, the kind of micro-adjustment that separated elite fighters from everyone else. Liston was preparing to throw his devastating left hook, the punch that had ended careers and dreams with equal indifference. But Ali had been studying that shoulder for months, watching fight films until his eyes burned, analyzing the exact sequence of muscle movements that preceded Liston's most dangerous weapon. He had shadowboxed against that shoulder in Miami gyms, had dreamed about it during restless nights in training camp, had felt its threat every time he closed his eyes and visualized this moment. The crowd's roar created a wall of sound that pressed against the ring from all directions, 3,000 voices unified in their hunger for violence that would justify the long drive through rural main roads, the $10 tickets, the beer and popcorn that had transformed this small-town gymnasium into the temporary center of the sporting universe. They wanted blood. They wanted drama. They wanted a fight that would be talked about for decades. Instead, they were about to witness something that would be argued about for decades. Ring announcer Johnny Addy had introduced both fighters with a theatrical flourish that boxing demanded, his voice carrying across the gymnasium with practiced authority that momentarily unified the crowd in appreciation for the ceremony of combat. But now the ceremony was over, replaced by the raw arithmetic of violence that reduced everything to the simple equation of who could hit harder and who could take more punishment. The referee, Jersey Joe Walcott, positioned himself with the careful precision of a man who understood that his primary job was to stay out of the way while two heavyweight champions attempted to destroy each other. His eyes moved constantly between the fighters, reading body language, anticipating the moments when intervention might be necessary to preserve life and limb. Ali's right shoulder twitched, a movement so quick that most eyes missed it entirely, a phantom motion that would later be dissected by slow-motion cameras and boxing experts and conspiracy theorists who would never agree on what actually happened in the humid air above the central main youth center canvas. The twitch was involuntary, the body's natural preparation for explosive movement, like a snake coiling before striking. The gymnasium air hung thick with more than just humidity and cigarette smoke. It carried the weight of expectation, the pressure of gambling interests, the tension of two men whose lives had been shaped by violence and who now faced each other across a space that could only be crossed through the application of that same violence. Every breath felt heavy, laden with possibilities that could transform careers and legacies in the span of a heartbeat. Liston's eyes showed no emotion as he moved forward, the same dead stare that had intimidated opponents for years, the look of a man who had seen too much violence to be impressed by the prospect of more. But beneath that surface calm, his body betrayed the micro-tensions of a fighter who understood he was facing something different. Someone who refused to be intimidated by reputation or history or the accumulated weight of fear. The twitch became a snap, the snap became a punch, and the punch became the most controversial moment in heavyweight boxing history. Ali's right hand moved through its arc with the speed of thought, covering those crucial 14 inches in a time frame that human eyes couldn't process, human minds couldn't fully comprehend, human memory couldn't accurately preserve. The impact was audible to those sitting closest to the ring, a sharp crack like a branch breaking, like a whip snapping, like the sound of physics operating at its most fundamental level. But the sound was brief, almost musical, lacking the thunderous collision that spectators expected from heavyweight punches, lacking the dramatic soundtrack that would have made the moment feel authentic to observers who had paid money to witness obvious violence. Liston's head jerked backward as if pulled by an invisible wire, not violently, not dramatically, but with a sudden snap of a man whose consciousness had been switched off like a light bulb. The movement was clinical, precise, almost gentle in its efficiency. There was no struggle, no moment of resistance, no dramatic wobble that would have telegraphed to the crowd what was happening to their former champion. His massive legs, which had carried him through decades of street fights and boxing wars, simply stopped functioning. The muscles that had powered him through championship fights, that had absorbed punishment that would have destroyed lesser men, that had carried him through a life defined by violence, went slack as if someone had cut the electrical current that powered them. His arms, which had hammered opponents into unconsciousness across 3 divisions, went limp as overcooked pasta. The hands that had learned violence in reform schools and perfected it in professional rings, that had earned him championship belts in fear, and the grudging respect of a sport that respected nothing except the ability to inflict and absorb punishment, fell to his sides with a helpless weight of mechanical failure. His eyes, which had stared down mob enforcers and championship contenders with equal indifference, rolled back to show only white. The gaze that had intimidated opponents before fights began, that had communicated threat without words, that had been his first weapon in every encounter, simply disappeared, replaced by the vacant expression of unconsciousness. The former champion dropped the canvas with the sound of 215 pounds of muscle and bone striking the ring floor, a sound that echoed through the gymnasium like a gunshot, sharp and final, and somehow wrong. The impact reverberated through the elevated platform, through the supporting structure, through the floorboards of the building itself, creating a physical vibration that spectators in the front rows could feel in their feet. Liston's body hit the canvas flat, arms spread wide in unconscious surrender, chest rising and falling with the rhythm of a man lost in unwanted sleep. He lay perfectly still except for that automatic breathing, his massive frame suddenly looking smaller, somehow diminished by the horizontal position that reduced him from threatening presence to vulnerable human being. Ali stood over the fallen champion for exactly 7 seconds, time enough for photographers to capture the moment, for the crowd to process what they believed they had witnessed, for history to freeze-frame itself around an image that would be reproduced and analyzed for generations. Those 7 seconds stretched like elastic time, expanded and contained all the implications of what had just occurred. His right fist remained clenched, knuckles still carrying the impact of contact, fingers wrapped around the ghost of the punch that had changed everything. His mouth was open in a roar of triumph that most of the crowd couldn't hear over their own confused shouting, but his expression carried something beyond simple celebration, vindication, perhaps, or the satisfaction of a man who had proven something that others had doubted. The camera shutter clicked once, twice, 3 times, a dozen times, each exposure capturing the moment from slightly different angles but with identical composition. The young champion standing in aggressive triumph, the fallen former champion spread across the canvas like a sacrifice to the gods of boxing violence. The photographers understood instinctively that they were documenting something historically significant, even if they couldn't yet comprehend exactly what that significance might be. But in the crowd, confusion was rapidly transforming into something darker, more dangerous. 3,000 people had witnessed the same event and somehow seen 3,000 different things. The human eye, it turned out, was an unreliable witness to events that unfolded at superhuman speed, leaving each observer to fill in the gaps with assumption, prejudice, and a particular angle for which they had viewed the action. Some swore they had seen the punch land clean, a perfect right hand that caught Liston moving forward into the impact, multiplying the force through the physics of collision. They insisted they had witnessed textbook boxing technique, applied with championship precision, a punch so perfectly timed and placed that it achieved maximum effect with minimal apparent effort. Others insisted they had seen nothing. No punch, no connection, no moment of contact that could possibly explain why the most feared heavyweight in boxing history was suddenly unconscious on the canvas. They had been watching intently. They claimed, their eyes focused on the exact spot where the action had taken place, and they had seen no punch worthy of name, certainly nothing that could account for such dramatic consequences. Fixed, the word erupted from somewhere in the back rows, cutting through confused buzz of conversation like a knife through fabric. It carried the accumulated frustration of spectators who felt cheated, who had expected obvious violence and received something that looked like sleight of hand, who had paid money for authentic combat, and received what appeared to be elaborate theater. The accusation was picked up by other voices, growing in volume and intensity until it became a chant, a collective verdict that what they had just witnessed was not legitimate competition, but choreographed entertainment performed for gambling interests and organized crime syndicates that allegedly controlled boxing's championship level. Jersey Joe Walcott stood in the center of the ring with the expression of a man who had just witnessed something that defied his decades of boxing experience. He had refereed championship fights, had seen every possible variation of knockout punch, had developed instincts that allowed him to read fights before the fighters themselves understood what was happening. But this moment challenged everything he thought he knew about the sport he had devoted his life to understanding. He looked down at Liston's motionless form, then up at Ali's expectant face, then out at the crowd whose confusion was rapidly turning to anger. His hands moved uncertainly, unsure whether to begin a count, call a doctor, or simply declare the whole thing a mistake that could be corrected through some administrative process that didn't exist in boxing's rule books. The referee's hesitation communicated itself to the crowd, adding another layer of confusion to an event that was already straining their ability to process what they believed they had witnessed. If the referee didn't know what to do, if a professional who had seen everything the sport could offer was paralyzed by uncertainty, then perhaps their own confusion was justified. Ali danced backwards on his toes, his arms raised in premature celebration, his voice cutting through the gymnasium noise with words that would be replayed on television for decades. Get up and fight! Get up and fight! But there was something in his expression, a flicker of uncertainty, a moment of doubt that suggested even he wasn't entirely sure what had just happened, what force had been unleashed through his fist, what physics had operated in those crucial 14 inches. The celebration in his voice carried undertones that only trained observers could detect. Not pure joy, but something more complex, more aware of the consequences that were already beginning to unfold. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the building, that victory achieved this quickly, this controversially, might prove more damaging than defeat. Liston remained motionless for 15 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. His massive chest continued its steady rhythm of unconscious breathing, but his eyes stayed closed, his limbs stayed limp, his consciousness remained wherever consciousness goes when perfectly timed punches land in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment with exactly the right force applied through exactly the right angle of impact. The crowd's anger grew louder, more organized, more dangerous. They had paid money to see a fight, not a 2-minute exhibition that ended with what looked like stage combat designed to separate them from their gambling stakes, while providing entertainment that felt artificial, unsatisfying, wrong in ways they couldn't articulate but could certainly feel. Beer cups began flying toward the ring, followed by popcorn boxes, followed by more serious debris that forced security guards to form protective lines around the elevated platform where boxing history was being written in invisible ink. The projectiles carried more than simple frustration. They expressed a sense of betrayal, a feeling that the fundamental contract between performer and audience had been violated. Sports reporters in the press section scribbled frantically in their notebooks, trying to capture something that seemed to defy capture, try to describe an event that had happened too quickly for human perception, but too slowly for easy dismissal. Their deadline pressures demanded clear narratives, Simple explanations, dramatic conclusions, but what they had witnessed was anything but clear. Television commentators spoke into their microphones with voices that carried barely concealed confusion, trying to provide explanation for something they didn't understand, trying to sell excitement for something that felt wrong to every instinct they had developed through years of covering combat sports. The cameras continued rolling, preserving every second of the aftermath for future analysis by experts who would never reach consensus about what they were seeing. Local police began moving through the gymnasium, their presence both reassuring and ominous. They positioned themselves between the crowd and the ring, creating a buffer zone that acknowledged the potential for serious trouble. Veteran officers recognized the atmospheric signs that preceded riots, the particular combination of confusion, anger, and alcohol that could transform entertainment into violence. Ali continued his victory dance, but it had become a performance now, a professional obligation rather than spontaneous joy. He understood that this victory would be questioned, analyzed, and ultimately diminished by the controversy surrounding its achievement. The knockout that should have secured his reputation had instead complicated in ways that would follow him for years, creating a shadow of doubt that would darken future victories. The gymnasium's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that the fight was officially over, that Muhammad Ali had retained his heavyweight championship by knockout in the first round. But the words seemed to bounce off the crowd's anger rather than penetrate it. Official pronouncement falling on ears that refused to accept official truth, creating a disconnect between institutional authority and popular perception that would define this moment's legacy. Liston's eyes finally opened after 47 seconds of unconsciousness. Not gradually, not with the confused blinking of a man returning to awareness, but suddenly, completely, as if someone had thrown a switch. The transition from unconsciousness to consciousness was so abrupt, so clinical, that it added another layer of strangeness to an event that already defied conventional explanation. He looked up at the gymnasium ceiling, then at Ali's dancing form, then at the referee who was still trying to decide what to do with a fight that had ended before it began. His expression showed none of the disorientation that typically followed knockout punches, none of the confusion that marked genuine unconsciousness, none of the vulnerability that characterized fighters who had been legitimately knocked out. The former champion's recovery was too quick, too complete, too controlled for spectators who expected to see the aftermath of devastating impact. Instead, they witnessed something that looked more like an actor rising from a stage death, creating another data point in their growing conviction that they had been deceived by elaborate theater rather than authentic competition. As Ali finally left the ring, still champion but somehow diminished by the manner of his victory, the controversy was already spreading beyond gymnasium walls, racing through telephone lines and radio waves to reach boxing fans across the country who would spend the next several decades arguing about what had really happened in those crucial 2 minutes in rural Maine. The fight had lasted exactly 132 seconds, but the debate it generated would last forever, becoming part of boxing folklore, part of American sports mythology, part of the permanent uncertainty that surrounds moments when reality refuses to conform to expectation.